By December of 1944, the Third Reich was a dying beast, cornered and bleeding, yet possessed of a final, feral strength. While the world and APO's eyes were fixed on the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes and the desperate struggle known as the Battle of the Bulge, a second, perhaps more cynical gamble was being prepared further south. This was Operation Nordwind. It was to be the final German offensive on the Western Front, a move born not of sound military logic, but of a desperate, systemic refusal to accept the inevitable. The strategic landscape of late 1944 was defined by a haunting irony. The Allies were suffering from the exhaustion of their own success, their supply lines stretched thin across a liberated Europe, while the German machine, though shattered, was compressing into a denser, more defensive posture. Hitler believed that the Allied coalition was a fragile glass structure, held together only by the momentum of victory. He theorized that a sufficiently violent shock would cause the political seams between Washington, London, and Paris to rupture. The objective of Nordwind was deceptively simple on paper: break through the thin lines of the US 7th Army in the Vosges Mountains and the Alsatian Plains, destroy the French First Army, and recapture the symbolic city of Strasbourg. To the Nazi leadership, Strasbourg was not just a city, it was a psychological anchor. Its loss would be a humiliation for Charles de Gaulle and a potential catalyst for a French political collapse. However, the systemic failures that plagued the German high command were evident before the first shell was fired. Control of the offensive was handed to Heinrich Himmler and his newly formed army group Oberrhein. Himmler, a man of bureaucratic terror rather than tactical brilliance, possessed almost no understanding of combined arms maneuver. His appointment was a symptom of Hitler's deepening paranoia, favoring ideological loyalty over the proven competence of the traditional Prussian officer corps. On the Allied side, the failure was one of perception. Intelligence had been so focused on the Ardennes that the sector held by the US 7th Army was dangerously thinned. General Alexander Patch was ordered to stretch his lines to cover the ground vacated by Patton's Third Army, which had pivoted north to save Bastogne. This left the 7th Army holding a massive front with exhausted divisions and green replacements who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The clock struck midnight on December 31, 1944. As the rest of the world ushered in a new year with hope, the frozen woods of the Vosges erupted in a symphony of fire. Unlike the Ardennes, there was no massive preliminary bombardment to signal the coming storm. The German infantry slipped through the darkness in white camouflage, moving like ghosts through the pine trees. They bypassed American strongpoints, infiltrating deep into the rear before the defenders even realized the line had been breached. The tactical disasters began almost immediately for the Americans. The 45th and 79th Infantry Divisions found themselves fighting a fragmented, confusing war in the dark. Communication lines were severed by German saboteurs and shellfire. Small units found themselves isolated on snowy ridges, surrounded by a determined enemy that seemed to appear from every shadow. The geography of the Vosges, with its narrow passes and steep ravines, turned every engagement into a claustrophobic slaughter. As the German pressure mounted, a profound political crisis erupted within the Allied High Command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, looking at the map with a cold, utilitarian eye, realized his lines were overextended. He proposed a strategic withdrawal, which meant abandoning the city of Strasbourg. To Eisenhower, it was a logical military consolidation. To Charles de Gaulle, it was an unthinkable betrayal of French sovereignty. The tension between Eisenhower and de Gaulle nearly fractured the alliance. De Gaulle threatened to withdraw his forces from the Supreme Command, effectively risking a civil war or a total collapse of the Southern Front. He famously told Eisenhower that the people of Alsace would see the withdrawal as a second abandonment, worse than that of 1940. Eventually, a tense compromise was reached, but the systemic friction had already cost precious time and clarity in the heat of the German assault. In the center of this chaos, the village of Hatton became the site of one of the most horrific tank battles of the entire war. For nearly 2 weeks, the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division and the 21st Panzer Division slammed into the US 14th Armored Division. Hatton was not a battlefield of grand maneuvers, it was a meat grinder. Tanks fired at each other from across narrow streets, and infantry fought room to room in burning houses while civilians huddled in cellars, trapped between two titans. The irony of Hatton was that both sides were fighting for a pile of rubble that had lost all strategic value. The German logistics were failing, their tanks were running out of fuel, and their reinforcements were being diverted back to the Eastern Front to face the looming Soviet tidal wave. Yet, the orders remained: attack at all costs. The German soldiers, many of them boys or middle-aged men from the Volkssturm, were being fed into the furnace of a dead ideology. Amidst this systemic collapse, unsung heroes emerged in the smallest pockets of resistance. On a nondescript ridge near Reipertswiller, isolated American platoons held out for days without food or ammunition, refusing to surrender even as their perimeters shrank to the size of a few foxholes. These men were not fighting for Strasbourg or the grand strategy of the High Command, they were fighting for the man to their left and right. Their stubbornness became the friction that slowly ground the German gears to a halt. By mid-January, the German offensive had lost its teeth. The US 7th Army, though battered and blooded, had refused to break. The German Unternehmen Nordwind had failed to achieve a single one of its strategic objectives. They had not taken Strasbourg, they had not destroyed the 7th Army, and they had certainly not broken the Allied alliance. Instead, they had wasted their final reserves of men and material on a secondary theatre while the Russians began their massive Vistula-Oder offensive in the east. The final days of Nordwind were a grim procession of retreats and local counterattacks. The landscape of Alsace was left scarred, a graveyard of burnt-out panthers and Shermans half-buried in the melting slush. The civilian population, caught in the middle, faced a winter of starvation and ruin. The systemic failure of the German command was now absolute. They had sacrificed their last remaining shield for a few miles of frozen ground they could not hold. The historical tragedy of Operation Nordwind lies in its utter futility. It was an offensive launched by a regime that had already lost the war but refused to stop the killing. It was the product of a command structure where reality was a secondary concern to the whims of a dictator. The men who died in the Vosges in January 1945 were victims of a profound lack of moral courage at the top levels of the German leadership, men who chose to prolong the agony of a continent rather than admit defeat. As the guns finally fell silent in late January, the cost became clear. The Americans had suffered nearly 15,000 casualties, and the Germans even more. For the soldiers who fought there, Nordwind would always be the forgotten battle, overshadowed by the scale of the Ardennes, yet no less brutal and perhaps even more cynical in its conception. It stands as a testament to the fact that even in the final hours of a war, the machinery of death can continue to turn out of sheer, mindless momentum. Philosophically, Nordwind teaches us about the danger of a leadership detached from the reality of the front line. It reveals how systemic failures, be they political, logistical, or moral, can transform a military force into a suicide pact. The tragedy of the Alsatian plains was not just a tactical disaster, but a structural collapse of human reason. It was the final, gasping breath of a monster that refused to die quietly, dragging thousands of lives into the grave with it. The snow eventually melted, revealing the debris of a broken empire and the bodies of those who had been sacrificed for a dream that had already turned to ash. The ruins of Hatton and the quiet ridges of the Vosges remain today as silent witnesses to this final gamble. They remind us that the end of a war is often its most senseless chapter, where the weight of past failures converges into a final, tragic crescendo of violence. The story of Nordwind is the story of the shadow that persists even as the sun begins to rise. It is the story of the unsung who held the line when the world was looking elsewhere. As we look back through the fog of history, we see not just a map of movements and counter-movements, but a portrait of human endurance in the face of systemic madness. The gamble failed, the line held, but the ghosts of January 1945 still linger in the cold mountain air. In the grand theatre of the Second World War, the curtain was closing. The actors were exhausted, the stage was burning, and the script had been discarded long ago. Nordwind was the final, desperate ad-lib of a dying villain, a move that changed nothing but the number of crosses in the earth. It remains a somber reminder that in the face of inevitable defeat, the most dangerous animal is the one that has nothing left to lose but its pride. The echoes of the artillery have long since faded into the rustle of the pines. Strasbourg remains a city of peace, its cathedral spire reaching toward a sky no longer filled with the smoke of burning tanks. But beneath the soil of Alsace, the iron and the bone remain, a permanent record of a disaster that history almost forgot, but the land will always remember. The final gamble was lost, and with it, the last remnants of a dark age crumbled into the winter mud.